Okay, audio is rolling, camera is rolling. All right, Tim, action.
Hello, my name is Tim Malone, and I'm a retired American history instructor. And I'm taping my lectures for my YouTube channel, Tim Malone History Lectures. Check it out. Today I'm going to talk about the causes of the Great Depression. Now, I've already put up a lecture on the Great Depression, sort of a general run through, and I'm coming back to tape a specific lecture on causes of the Great Depression because I think it's one of the more pertinent, one of the more interesting, one of the more useful topics in all of American history. Causes of the Great Depression. It's a highly contested, controversial topic to this day. And remember, the great crash on Wall Street was 1929, and this is 2025. So we're talking about 90 years ago, an event 90 years ago. And it's still, the Great Depression is still very pertinent to today. We have a very similar economy. Lots of technological changes, but the way our economy functions, how money flows, how credit flows, very similar. Capitalism. Capital C capitalism. We still have a capitalist economy. Now, I'm kind of humble when it comes to economic history. I never took an econ class in college. I'm kind of self-taught. But of course, I taught American history for years. And if you teach American history, of course, you have to teach the economic history of the country. And if you say, I'm going to talk about the economic history of the United States of America, what's the number one event? What's the headline? The Great Depression. The number one economic event still. Now, we've had the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, 2010, and I'm going to talk about that. I have a lecture on the Great Recession. I think that's what it's going to be called. Some wanted to call it the Lesser Depression. There were some other names for it, but I think the Great Recession. And let me just give an aside here. The Great Recession of 2008, 2009, 2010, the second most consequential, the second most serious, the second most important economic event in our history. Perhaps it's a bit early to come to that conclusion. The Great Recession has altered the way the Great Depression is viewed. Now, this is typical history stuff, all right? You have an event that's interpreted a certain way for a good long time, and then another event in the same category occurs, and it changes how historians, economists, view the original powerful event. So I would tell my students after the Great Recession that the Great Recession is going to change how we view the Great Depression. Now, since I retired 5 years ago, I have to confess I haven't kept up like I used to. And it's funny because I think the Great Recession has kind of disappeared from our discourse, even our economic discourse. Where's the Great Recession these days in discussion of current economic events? It's like the establishment, the inside the Beltway crowd, the pundits, and the advisors want to bury the Great Recession. They don't want to talk about it. That just seems that way to me. I mean, that's my opinion. But at any rate, I decided to do a lecture on causes of the Great Depression because I think it's pertinent to this day. I keep saying pertinent. It's important today to understand what historians think about the causes of this significant event, not only in economic history, but in all of American history, the Great Depression. But as I implied, as I sit here in May of 2025, I may be behind the interpretations of the Great Depression as seen through the lens of the Great Recession. But I decided I'm going to go forward with my traditional lecture on causes of the Great Depression, and we'll come back. There'll be a lecture on the Great Recession when we'll get a chance to reprise the interpretive structure of these two economic events. Now, we've talked before in these lectures about the anatomy of the historical examination of an event, how historians think about an event. And I've mentioned this in other lectures. There's causes, the event itself, and then the consequences. Causes, the event itself, and then the consequences of the event. We fit the Great Depression into that anatomy. You get, well, first off, under causes, there's proximate causes and underlying causes. And again, the Civil War is the classic example. The election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln, November of 1860, is the proximate cause. Slavery, the division of the nation over the issue of slavery, was the underlying cause. The event itself is examined next, and then the consequences of the event. And boy, we're still talking about consequences of the Great Depression today. 90 years. I think that's a long time. And consequences, there's two aspects. There's short-term consequences and long-term consequences. Now, for the Great Depression causes, for the Great Depression, most historians now think the stock market crash was the proximate cause, the spark that lit the fire. There were more profound underlying causes. Now, I wrote that some years ago, and that seems to be the consensus. Now, again, I've said this in the previous lecture on the Great Depression and the New Deal. My mom and dad were children, adolescents of the Great Depression. My dad was 13 when the crash occurred, and my mother was 9. And they talked about the Great Depression, about how low prices were, about how the bread lines, even in Crystal Lake, Illinois, or Wilmington, Illinois, where my folks were from, the palpable unemployment, the closed factories, the closed stores. My dad said in Crystal Lake, Illinois, where he was farm, that there was a subdivision, houses were being built, and the crash occurred and work stopped. Bang. And he said those half-built houses were there 10 years later. Not a nail had been driven for 10 years. That's kind of what happened with the Great Recession, which was centered on the housing market. So it seems to be accepted wisdom amongst historians that the crash wasn't the big underlying cause of the Great Depression. It was the proximate cause. The metaphor is the pile of brush, dry brush, is the underlying cause. And the match, the spark. The crash was the spark. Now, sometimes I sit back and I say, no, because again, if you would have asked my mom and dad what caused the Great Depression, they would have said without hesitating a second, they would have said the stock market crash on October 29th, 1929. The stock market crash. They lived through it. They wouldn't have said, oh, that was just the spark. There were more profound underlying causes. No, that was the cause. And there's something to that. In retrospect, you can always find underlying causes for something. There's always, and you don't notice them until the catastrophe happens, And then you look back and say, oh yeah, here, look, the housing market, right? The stock market, speculation, crime, abuse. But those things are always there. There's always underlying causes. So maybe it was the stock market crash. Maybe it is the spark. The spark is the underlying cause. I don't know. I go back and forth on this. I think my presentation today here will be that there were more profound underlying causes. But I don't know. Sometimes I wonder about that. The immediate cause was the Great Crash. Not the underlying cause, because since 1929 we've had similar stock market crashes without Great Depressions. It's not like you have a stock market crash and you automatically get a 12-year really bad, deep depression. So here, again, I go around on this. Underlying causes. The underlying causes of the Great Depression. Boy, the rubber meets the road here. Because again, it's still controversial and it's politicized. The causes of the Great Depression 90 years ago are heavily politicized today. Liberals and conservatives differ. Republicans and Democrats differ profoundly about what caused the Great Depression. It's heavily politicized. This is Kindleberger. Charles Kindleberger. He died several years ago. He wrote a book about crashes and panics and depressions and recessions. And he had as the number one cause of the Great Depression, underlying cause, no international stabilizing mechanism in the 1930s. No international stabilizing mechanism. In other words, and here's how this goes. Capitalism, capital C capitalism, is by its very nature, cannot be otherwise, an international system. There is no such thing as capitalism in one country. Capitalism, from its inception, and we can argue about, I have a lecture on capitalism, I don't think I've given it yet. Well, that's a complicated one too. What is capitalism? Where is it? When is it? Capitalism is international in its very essence. Again, let me repeat. There's no such thing as capitalism in one country. It's international by its very nature. And the system needs to be stabilized. And before the World War I, England, the foremost economic power in the world, England, its financial system, the English pound, the Bank of England, the funded debt, the gilts. England dominated the international capitalism system. And when a bank in Austria would fail, and the nature of capitalism is that it's a chain of debt. We thought of it as a chain of debt. We thought of it as dominoes, right? And when the first one tips, it's going to go. The nature of capitalist system is there's a tendency for the nature of there to be a panic, a depression. The dominoes fall. So somebody's got to step in, stop the dominoes from falling. And for the first, Bank of England is established in 1680s, late 1680s, the Bank of England. The Bank of England would stabilize the system, would bail out foreign banks to stop the dominoes from falling, because as the number one capitalist country in the world, as the number one trading company in the world, or country in the world, as the number one manufacturing country in the world, it was in England's best interest, self-interest, to stop the dominoes from falling. So the Bank of England would intervene. They stabilized. The Bank of England was the international stabilizing mechanism. World War I cashed England out of that role. World War I destroyed English hegemony in a lot of ways. And so who was the number one? In 1919, when when the Treaty of Versailles signed, who's the number one financial country in the world? The United States of America. Yet we have a tradition at that point in 1919, still to this day, scratch an American, find an isolationist, to this day, America first. The United States held all the cards. The United States was the New England in 1919, financial hegemon. And yet the isolationists ruled the Senate. And the United States didn't sign the Treaty of Versailles, didn't join in, didn't assume the mantle of financial hegemon. So after World War I, England couldn't, and the United States wouldn't stabilize the international system. The system needs a stabilizer. Now we have the International Monetary Fund and various other PACs showing the international, the cosmopolitan, the worldwide nature of this thing we call capitalism. Let me repeat, capitalism is an international system by definition, and it needs to be internationally stabilized. Cooperation is necessary to stabilize the system, and that's another thing after World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. Germany, one of the top, even after its defeat in World War I, one of the top 4 or 5 economies in the world, Germany, was looking for an excuse to get out of reparation payments, and a good, nice depression fit the bill. Now, in addition to getting them out of reparations, it's also brought Hitler to power. Not a good thing. Cooperation, international cooperation, and that's why today, as I sit here, May 2025, with the Trump administration and America First and tariffs, unilateral tariffs, that's not international cooperation. I saw Warren Buffett, the billionaire investor king, on TV somewhere last week, where he said tariffs are acts of war, economic war. And you hear it in the mainstream media, you hear that term today. The United States is waging economic war through these tariffs. No, cooperation. That's why it's the system after World War II, after the failure of the peace of World War I, after World War II, the United States shouldered up to its responsibility, became the leader, the financial leader of the world, the lender of last resort, the United States. Did that. After World War I, the United States didn't shoulder up to its responsibility as the stabilizer of worldwide capitalism. Cooperation is necessary. And so the thought is there a big economy, a big important economy that doesn't want to cooperate? Well, the United States, which again is baffling because we're in the catbird seat, we're number one. Why would the top of the international capitalist system cause trouble, wage economic war, get out of cooperation, rescind cooperation agreements? Why? I don't know. It doesn't make any sense to me. So a lack of international cooperation between World War I and World War II, when the shock came, the great crash, it pulled down banks, nations, as it would. It's an international system by nature. There was nobody there to stop the dominoes from falling. And you had an actor, Germany, who wanted the dominoes to fall. So now you think, is there a big actor today? Well, the United States. I'm running in a loop here. I'm baffled by why the number one country, the number one capitalist country, would try to subvert the system. And I'm worried. Trade wars, lead to real wars. I mean, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, we'll mention that as we go along here about causes of the Great Depression. Trade wars lead to real wars. Number 2, so lack of international cooperation led the stock market crash to have consequences it really shouldn't have. The second underlying cause was the bad economics cause. Now, I love this one. And you can sort of say, well, that's the part and parcel of the first one, lack of international cooperation, is a failure of economic thought. The bad economic cause. What caused the Great Depression? Bad economic thinking. The economists failed us. Our vision of the economy, this thing we call the economy, this monster we call the economy, this indescribable, incomprehensible thing we call the economy. Those whose profession is to think about the economy and theorize about the economy and give advice to politicians about what's the best way to prosperity and wealth creation, those guys failed. The philosophy, the economic philosophy between the wars and well before the war, World War I, between the wars, laissez-faire, small government. No, if it means running deficits, if it means strengthening the central government, we don't want international stabilization. It's one way to think about it. We don't want international stabilization. No, don't you understand? If you're a capitalist, a hardcore capitalist, and you understand the system at all in a pragmatic way, you have to have a stabilizer, and that has to be a government. It has to be some entity that can create money, that can control debt flows. Peter Timman wrote a book in which he said, what caused the Great Depression? Well, the crash started it. But then stubborn Herbert Hoover and other leaders of advanced industrial nations, stubborn adherents to the gold standard. They wouldn't go off gold. Oh no, here we go, the gold standard. Oh. The idea that currency, paper money, the paper money in circulation should be backed by gold is old. It goes way back to the foundation of what we might call economics. It was unchallenged. Now there's still gold bugs around, that's what they're called. There's still people out there saying that the dollar should be backed by gold. And what does that mean? That means if you have a $100 bill, you could go to a Federal Reserve and get $100 worth of gold on demand. The hardcore gold standard is full convertibility of paper money into gold on demand. The bearer can get gold. It's the dollar is as good as gold. Now, the gold standard was never that simple, never that straightforward. There were always ways under the gold standard for inflation to take place here and there. Because that's the goal of the gold standard, is no inflation. The dollar is going to be worth the same 100 years from now, 200 years from now under the gold standard. That turns out that if you are in the gold standard and you have a crash, a speculative bubble, stock market, and it crashes, the government can't create money to replace the money that's gone bad. The bad debt where money disappears, where chains of debt, because the stock market crashes and people had borrowed money to buy stock, they're not going to pay that money back. The money, in effect, disappears. And the money supply, in a panic and a depression, a crash. Now what we've learned, John Maynard Keynes, we'll talk about him. We learned that the stabilizer should create money, which governments can do. Well, no, not under the gold standard. See, that's the point of the gold standard, is to limit the ability of governments to create money out of thin air. And yet it turns out there's times when the government must create money out of thin air to stabilize the system, to prevent the dominoes from falling, to prevent 30% unemployment, to prevent Hitler's being elected. And Hoover wouldn't do it. Hoover wouldn't take the country off gold. He was stubborn. Now again, everybody was a gold bug back then. Well, not everybody. There were the populists in the 1880s and 1890s. The government had printed greenbacks when the war was on, the Civil War. The government didn't have any trouble going off gold and creating a bunch of greenback paper money to finance the war. The gold standard. There's still gold bugs out there. Doesn't make any sense to me. So it wasn't just that Hoover wouldn't take the country off gold, which Franklin Roosevelt is elected in 1932. He comes in 1933 and he swears himself in and goes down the street to the White House and takes the country off gold. And the New Deal, recovery. So bad economic thinking, bad economic theories can destroy a capitalist economy. And people say ideas aren't important. Economists, there's a bunch, like this rational expectations, this idea that markets are always rational. It's kind of a current gold standard kind of thinking. It's still with us. Markets can be terribly wrong. Markets can be irrational. Markets can be stupid. But not according to the rational expectations school, right? Markets are always right. Markets always clear. Markets are never irrational. What a joke. I'm saying this to give you an example of what I think is a current stupid economic theory that may be leading us down the path again. Economists are very powerful. Economic theories are very powerful. I used to tell my students, I'd say, if you want to rule the world, study econ. Become an economist, because there's 195, I don't know how many countries there are, that you hear different numbers all the time. 195 nations in the world, and the leader of every one of them, even places that are in chaos, like South Sudan, even places like that, the leader, no matter how tentative he may be, the leader of every one of those 195 countries has an econ major whispering in his ear. Every one. You want to rule the world, become an economist. So that was the second one, this underlying causes of the Great Depression. Lack of an international stabilizer. England couldn't, and the United States wouldn't, and Germany wanted economic chaos. Again, let's go back to that. Is there any big players? Well, no, we already decided it's the United States of all. The United States, the number one, the hegemon, wants trouble? Wants trouble in the international economy. Talk about playing with fire. Lack of cooperation, bad economic thinking. Wow. And then number three, the third underlying cause, and again, I'm kind of picking and choosing here. We'll come back to a more expansive list. But the third one is maldistribution of wealth. Wow. Maldistribution of wealth caused the Great Depression. Not enough Americans had enough money to survive the disruption. Not every dollar disappeared when the stock market crashed and all those chains of debt went bad. Not all money disappeared, but enough that just about everybody felt it. Well, especially, the 25% to 30% of Americans who lost their jobs. There wasn't enough money. There wasn't enough savings. People didn't have enough buffer. The lower two-fifths, the lower three, well, everybody, but from the middle class on down particularly, didn't have enough money to spend. Consumption cratered. Demand. We talked about demand in the previous lecture, about the balance between supply and demand. Demand was devastated by the crash and the subsequent failure of banks and mortgage outfits and stock brokerage firms. They were devastated. They may not have owned any stock, but the money supply cratered. And again, because he was an adherent of the gold standard, Herbert Hoover, the president, no, I'm not going to increase the money supply. Because now we know that when that happens, when chains of debt go bad and money disappears and the money supply craters, the government, the Federal Reserve, the government should step in and flood the zone with money. Borrow and spend. Worry about paying it back later. Of course, now we borrow and spend every year, whether good times or bad. And that's much, the deficit and the debt are much in the news. My entire life. The United States has been on the verge of bankruptcy. I don't think so. The maldistribution of wealth. Now, maybe I should talk about that a little bit here. I was going to put that off. About the maldistribution of wealth. Probably I should do an entire lecture on the history of the maldistribution of wealth. Because when you think back into ancient times and medieval times, they had terrible distributions of wealth, worse than what we have now. The United States, before the Great Depression, the United States had the worst distribution of wealth. In other words, the rich had more and the rest had less than ever in our history. Until now, because the Great Depression, the New Deal, the income tax, World War II, shrank the difference between the rich and the poor. We've done it. We've done it. We've shrank the difference between rich and poor. We've done it before in our history. But ever since Reagan came in, tax cuts for the rich, trickle-down economics, talk about another misbegotten, wrong economic theory that's still with us and distorting our economy. Trickle down. Give tax cuts to the rich and everything will be great because they'll hire the peasants. Maldistribution of wealth. It's the worst now it's ever been in our history, even worse than before the crash. And leftists, socialist economists say that can trigger a crash, even in a rich country. Maldistribution of wealth. Here's some quotes on maldistribution of wealth. Maldistribution of wealth can significantly affect economic growth and social stability. The rich get too rich. The rich can get too rich and threaten economic growth and social instability. In other words, riots in the street. Now you might say, well, what are you talking about in the United States? There's no threat of that. In the United States, the poor people are richer than any place else. And that's true. But you got to remember the French peasantry in 1789 in France was the richest peasantry in Europe. And they revolted in the French Revolution. They burned the manor houses down. They strung up the lords. They were the richest peasants in Europe, and it got too much. The rich got too rich. Now, see, that's, you can say, oh, you're a commie, un-American. The rich can't get too rich. Yes, they can. Even in a rich country. The maldistribution of wealth and income is a powerful force driving a widening gap between rich and poor, which in turn fuels social and political unrest. That's by Joseph Stiglitz, an economist. Income and wealth equals power, and economic power equals political power. Creates a downward spiral. Rich getting too rich creates a downward spiral. The rich get rich and the poor get poorer. Both communism and fascism arise from maldistribution of wealth. Now, that's a generalization. But we have the most unequal distribution of wealth in our history, and we have a fascist movement in the United States. Both communism and fascism arise from income distribution, maldistribution. And let me point out that it doesn't matter how rich your society is. It's a matter of perception by the populace of rich and poor. And let me also point out that we've solved this problem in the past. Now, it took a depression and a war and a New Deal and 50, 60 years of liberal rule in the country to bring that gap down. And then the Reagan Revolution, the reassertion of conservative economic theory, the trickle-down theory, and widens back out. It widens back out. Now I'm going to talk about some textbooks. Alan Brinkley, that American history book. I've mentioned, and again, let me just quickly reprise. I have 30 textbooks from like 1998 to 2019 because they'd send them to me free at my job as a history teacher at Elgin Community College to solicit my business, to have my students buy their textbook. They'd give them to me. So I have a lot. And I've done some work with them. I've worked with these textbooks because I think while the historical profession, while historians sort of all require their survey classes to have American history textbooks, it's how historians get rich is selling textbooks, writing and selling textbooks. Brinkley is number one. He's in his 16th, 17th edition. Alan Brinkley. But I got 30 different ones, and I've had piles of textbook on the table on these lectures, previous lectures. Historians kind of they write them and get rich writing them, but they disdain them. In an academic article or an academic monograph, it's a rule. You can't cite in a footnote a textbook. Now, I'm like, what? Why? These big wigs write them, right? But you can't cite them? In some ways, these textbooks are the closest the closest the population gets to reading history, and yet they're not allowed in a bibliography. So I'm going to talk about some textbooks again here. And I'm going to start with Brinkley's. Causes of the Great Depression. 1, lack of diversification. Too much economic activity and too few industries. Maldistribution of wealth. There it is. Unstable credit structure. Bad debt everywhere. Now, I've made this point before. Let me make it again. In retrospect, you can always see weaknesses in an economy. They're always there. You have an event, a crash, and then the historians are like, what? Oh, look, there's a weakness in the credit structure. Might I posit that there's always weaknesses in capitalist credit structures? Always, even when high flying, everybody's wages are up and wealth's up and the stock market's up, economy's going gangbusters. There's weaknesses in the debt. There always is. So I don't know about that cause. Declining exports. The Smoot-Hawley tariff, 1930, because the economy crashes, and a lot of Americans' response was, damn foreigners, let's protect our industry. We're not going to import cars. We're not going to import anything. We'll solve this depression by concentrating production in the United States. Boy, does that sound familiar. And no, you don't put walls up. It's an international system. You got to cooperate. You got to try to figure it out with your trading partners. You got to be nice, cooperative. We got to cooperate. Oh, and here he has debt on here twice. He says unstable debt structure in the United States and unstable international debt structure. I think, Alan, maybe those two should be combined. Unstable debt structures. So let me, here, I should do this. See, the causes of the Great Depression is a complicated subject. And it's multifaceted. We're talking about causes of the Great Depression. I probably should have mentioned Peter Temin's work first, but let me do it now. He writes, Peter Temin, The Spoils of War, the first chapter of his book, which is the printed version of a series of lectures he gave. The Depression of the 1930s was a watershed in the history of modern economies. But it was one aspect of a major watershed in world history, what Churchill termed the Second 30 Years' War. Lionel Robbins foreshadowed this view at the time he wrote his book on the Depression in 1933, even though he obviously could not see the end of this convolution. He did recognize its start. He therefore began his analysis for proclaiming, we live not in the fourth, but in the 19th year of the world crisis, 1934. This view is instructive and one that I want to keep in mind because it places the Depression in historical context. The origins of the Great Depression lie largely in the disruptions of World War I. What caused the Great Depression? We got a whole literature. I just presented some of it to you. But Temin, not just him, what caused the Great Depression? World War I. Its spread owes much to the hostilities, continuing conflicts that were created by the end of the war and the Treaty of Versailles, and its effects, particularly the victory of National Socialism in Germany, clearly extend to the Second World War. It is instructive to see the 30 years following 1914 as one long conflict with an uneasy truce in the middle. World War I and World War II are going to come to be seen as one war with a 20-year truce. This makes the Great Depression unusual in its historical context, but it does not thereby make it irrelevant to current events. Indeed, the interaction of economics and politics that is central to my story of the Depression is a constant of economic and political life, and it is within the realm of possibility that politicians would again make choices that would lead to another Great Depression. Economics is political. Just like capitalism's international. And boy, you can sure feel that today. Always, my entire life. Economics is politically charged. Left, right, socialist, capitalist, Republican, Democrat. Let me talk about causes of the Great Depression in some more textbooks. Here's Nation of Nations, a concise narrative of the American Republic by Davidson et al., 1994. So this is an old textbook. On page 690, there's a section, The Causes of the Great Depression. The following points are made. Overexpansion and decline in purchasing power. Not enough of the gains of the roaring 20s, went to the workers. Consumer debt and uneven distribution of wealth. There it is again. By 1929, 1% of the population owned 36% of all personal wealth. It's worse than that now. The banking system was unstable. Again, let me repeat, the banking system is always unstable. Corporate structure was unstable and public policy weak. Big business operated largely unchecked. Huge corporations ruled the economy and they ruled it badly. Corporations ruled the economy badly. Government regulation, lack of government regulation of the heights of the economy. Big corporations, big banks, big insurance companies were not regulated enough. Sick industries. Davidson, sick industries. Textiles, coal mining, lumbering, and railroads were sick. There's always sick industries. Oh, here's the last one. Economic ignorance. Wow, I love that. What caused the Great Depression? Economic ignorance. I talked about that a few minutes ago. Bad economic theory. Stubborn adherence to the gold standard. Economic ignorance. Another textbook, The American People, Creating a Nation and Society by Nash, 1998. The following points are made. Why did the nation sink deeper and deeper into depression? After all, only about 2% of the population owned stock. The answer is complex, but the prosperity of the 1920s, it appears in retrospect, was superficial. What caused the Great Depression? Superficial prosperity? I don't know about that. There was a relative decline in purchasing power. Boy, that's in all of them. A decline in purchasing power. Not enough money in the hands of the consuming class. Stock market crash revealed serious structural weaknesses in the financial and banking system. 7,000 banks had failed during the 1920s before the crash. Now, thousands went out of business within the first couple of years after the crash, but 7,000 banks had failed in the 9 years before the crash. The banking system was weak. Banking system's always weak. The Federal Reserve Board, fearing inflation, tightened credit, exactly the opposite of the action that they would have taken in a fight to fight a slowdown in purchasing power. Mistakes by the Federal Reserve. Again, bad theory. Mistakes by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve can cause a depression? I think. High tariffs had reduced trade. Tariffs caused the depression? The federal government might have prevented the stock market crash and the depression by more careful regulation of business and the stock market. Oh, okay. Coulda, shoulda, woulda. America Past and Present by Devine, 1999. The basic explanation of the Great Depression lies in the fact that U.S. factories produced more goods than the American people could consume. It all came down to the fact that people did not have enough money to buy the products coming off the assembly lines. That seems to be a recurring theme. The new economic system of the 1920s failed to distribute wealth more broadly. Again, maldistribution of wealth. Historians seem to love that one. Makes you wonder about today. Again, we're a very rich country. But again, it's relative. It's relative wealth that seems to matter. American Promise, A History of the United States by Rourke, 2009. Wealth was badly distributed. There we go. And again, number one. And by 1929, the inequality of wealth produced serious problems in consumption. It was once thought that the crash alone caused the Great Depression, my mom and dad. It did not. In 1929, the national and international economies were already riddled with severe problems, but the dramatic losses of the stock market crash, the sudden collapse of a mood of exuberance, and the fear of risking what was left acted as a great brake on economic activity. Psychological. Now Keynes, we'll talk about Keynesianism. Keynes will sort of highlight the psychological aspect of the Great Depression and the economy. President Hoover's circumscribed notions of legitimate government action proved vastly inadequate to address the problems of restarting the economy and ending human suffering. Hoover, what caused the Great Depression? Herbert Hoover. That puts a face on it. And boy, he suffered to this day his historical reputation, Herbert Hoover, on account of his action or lack. Now, in Hoover's defense, he did some things. But he wouldn't take the country off gold. He wouldn't expand the money supply. He's the face of the Great Depression. Well, of course, what happened in his first year? He served 3 years as the things went down. Maybe he deserves his historical reputation. Out of Many by Farragher, that's the textbook I used for years. It would be oversimple to say that the 29 stock market crash caused the Great Depression. Signs of deep economic weakness had already begun to surface amid the general prosperity of the 20s. First, workers and consumers received too small a share of the enormous increase in labor productivity in the 1920s. The most important weakness in the economy was the extremely unequal distribution of wealth. Boy, there we are again. That's what we should watch, apparently. And it's the worst. It's worse than it was before 1929 now. Liberty, Equality, and Power by Murin et al., 1999. What caused the Great Depression? Stock market speculation. There we go, Mom and Dad. Stock market speculation. A bubble. A deep, highly inflated, irrational stock market bubble. Bubbles, speculative bubbles. A speculative bubble, and it's inevitable, bursting. That's number one. Any explanation of the depth and longevity of the Great Depression must begin with the collapse of the stock market. Eventually, stock prices were bid up to irrational levels. Still, the crash by itself does not explain why the Great Depression lasted as long as it did. Bubble burst, and then bad economics. Hoover, the Federal Reserve, did the wrong things because they believed the wrong theories about the economy. Oh, here it is, number 2. Mistakes by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve curtailed the amount of money in circulation and raised interest rates. The exact opposite of what we do now. An ill-advised tariff, Murin. Again, that recurring tariff, and here we are, we're in the midst of tariff season again. Tariffs cause recessions, tariffs cause depressions, tariffs can contribute to downturns. That's what seems to be what historians think. Oh, here we go, maldistribution of wealth. Again, a serious maldistribution in the nation's wealth that had developed in the 20s stymied recovery from the Depression. The Coolidge administration, before Hoover, contributed to this misdistribution by lowering taxes on the wealthy, therefore increasing the proportion of national wealth concentrated in their hands. The rich can be too rich and tank the economy. And we solved that problem, how it's called the income tax. I talked about the income tax in the progressive lecture. The income tax, the much hated, the much reviled essence of our prosperity, the income tax. Let's hear it. 3 cheers for the income tax.